Yeah, meanwhile, I'll go live on YouTube as well. We're live on YouTube as well. And we have got a couple of people who joined us. We can, I think, wait for 2 more minutes and then start.
Yeah.
You say Gautam
That's
Ishita.
great.
Yeah, let's start. Ishita.
Umang, you've begun the live streaming?
Yeah, the live streaming is also started.
All right. So I think let's start then, and people can keep coming. Okay.
Yeah.
Hello, everyone. Hello, everyone. Welcome to the Mithila Review Show. I'm your host, Ishita Singh, the managing editor of Mithila Review, the journal of international science fiction and fantasy. The Mithila Review Show is an inclusive platform that hosts writers, editors, publishers, and readers from around the world to expand conversation about speculative imaginations of past, present, future, and beyond. For the second episode of the MR Show, writer, editor, and lawyer Gautam Bhatia will be conversing with Umang Poddar about his debut novel, The Wall, the horizons of SFF genre in South Asia, and the futures of the genre across the globe. Gautam Bhatia is a writer, editor, and lawyer. His debut novel, The Wall, came out in 2020. He's also the coordinating editor at Strange Horizons, a weekly magazine of and about speculative fiction. In another world, Gautam is a lawyer and a constitutional law expert. Welcome to the show, Gautam. Over to you, Umang.
Yeah, thank you, Ishita. So, welcome everyone. I'm Umang, and I'm a first reader at Mithila Review. Mithila Review is an international science fiction and fantasy magazine founded in late 2015. We publish literally speculative fiction and poetry, both from science fiction and fantasy, film and book reviews, essays, and interviews from across the world. Thank you so much, Gautam, for joining us today. As somebody who's himself a lawyer and an SFF enthusiast, I'm very excited to be talking to you today.
Thanks.
Yeah. So let's begin, Gautam.
Yeah.
Yeah, and those who are joining us right now, if you have any questions, any comments, please feel free to put them in the chat box or the Q&A box. We'll either take it along as we go, or we'll ask like all these questions once towards the end. So, so with that, let's begin. Gautam, we are interviewing the writer Gautam Bhatia today. I wanted to ask, is it separate from like the lawyer Gautam Bhatia, or is it the same?
Sorry, I just lost you for a moment. Could you repeat that?
Yeah, I was asking that today we are talking to the science fiction writer Gautam Bhatia. Is it the same as the constitutional lawyer Gautam Bhatia, or you think those are like different people, similar people?
It's the same person. Uh, I spend some time in the day, like engaging with law, and sometime in the day, like reading science fiction, writing it. So it's the same person, but of course, like there are um, two very different disciplines. Especially writing in both of them requires very different kind of approach. So of course, as I've said this before, the two things bleed into each other. So just like say when a person whose day job is an engineer, writes science fiction, you can expect that the dimensions of the spaceship, if there is a spaceship, are going to be like correct, and then how it operates will be broadly conforming to
Hello.
a function of. Can you hear me?
Yeah, I got them.
Yeah. So, but that's just function of the fact that your day job gives you certain kind of expertise that you draw upon when you're like writing. Yeah.
Yeah, but I've seen that like when the wall came out, a lot of people were like reading your like constitutional theory or your work as a constitutional lawyer into your fiction, and I saw that was something which you were like trying to avoid or not engage at some level. So like, what was the reason
Yeah. That
behind that? Do
that
you think it takes away from
that
the
irritates
story?
me a lot. As I said again, just like if you have an engineer who's writing like science fiction, you don't like look at the history of their work in engineering and say, oh, okay, this segment or this part of the book, it must be like about engineering. You have like again, you have people like Vandermeer and so on who write climate fiction, and who also do separate work in climate fiction. And of course, there's a conversation to be had about how the two interact. But it's not that when you're reading a Vandermeer book, like you first look at all his actual work in preservation and then like start reading that into the book, right? So that's not how you read a Vandermeer book. You read the book on its own terms. And so yeah, like I've had questions like, or reviews that say stuff like, oh, like this section of the book is uh, jurisprudential, or they're like jurisprudential debates and stuff, and they're actually not. And those sections that people think are to do with jurisprudence actually are not. And it's just like if they didn't know that I was a lawyer, they wouldn't be reading that into the book. So I don't think.
Hello, I think I lost you for a second there, Gautam.
I have Wi-Fi. One sec.
Yeah, and like people in the audience who've joined us, meanwhile, if you have any questions, any comments, anything, please feel free to put them, and like we'll take it up. And also those who are joining us through YouTube, like I'll eventually look at the YouTube chat as well and see what
Yeah,
questions
sorry.
there are.
Can you
So
can you can you can you hear me now?
yeah, much better.
Yeah. So that's so on that side. So I don't think that you should be reading like a writer's day job into the book.
Yeah. So, but like in the book, as you were also saying, there were a lot of, for example, you're dealing with like lots of issues in terms of what exactly is the meaning of freedom, or like there's some reference to say some like constitution as well, which I thought in terms of like there are six rights, which are like six fundamental rights, which they talk about at multiple points. There are some like restrictions to those rights. But like apart from that, there's also like a lot of thing about like political economy, sociology, anthropology. So and I've seen that you also like read a lot of nonfiction. So in that, like, how do you see like your nonfiction, like reading and writing, inspire like what you're writing in terms of fiction? And also, is there a conscious effort also to read say certain kinds of like nonfiction to have like your story in terms of, I don't know, like world building, or in terms of giving it a particular narrative? So can you talk a little about that?
Yeah, so I'll answer that in two parts. I don't think nonfiction reading inspires fiction; it informs fiction, right? So it informs fiction in the sense that any kind of world building in speculative fiction obviously needs to be internally coherent and be recognizable in some way, and to do a good job, or a plausible job of making a world recognizable, you need to pay attention to the political structures, the economic structures, the way society is structured, how that will have an impact on day-to-day relations and so on. And the humanities as a discipline is dedicated to dealing with those kinds of questions. So obviously, in that sense, the nonfiction that you read will inform the world building that you do. And it's not just the humanities. I mean, it would inform just basic stuff like having a plausible understanding of how supply chains work in whatever world you're choosing to build, in whatever way you're choosing to build it. Like agriculture, for example, right? Like it's such an important part. Like how is food produced? How is food distributed? How is it consumed? How is clothing produced? So based on the fundamental premises of your world, you have to answer all these questions. And nonfiction reading is where that knowledge or those insights come from. So I think it informs your world building, but I wouldn't say it inspires it. Secondly, what specific nonfiction? So that depends upon the specific questions you're trying to answer. And I've used this example before, but the wall is what you call a semi-closed system, where the air is obviously like freely transferable back and forth from the outside world to the inside world, and the premise is that the water supply is infinite, and that's part of the plot. But everything else is scarce, and everything else is contained within the wall. Now that obviously raises a number of questions, and just something as basic as the fact that if you don't have any bees, specifically any fauna, any bees, then your crops can't pollinate. So the only crops you can have are self-pollinating crops. And so then obviously you have to do research to ensure that the crops that are there in your world are self-pollinating, because if they're not, then the internal coherence of your world breaks down. So as you're doing your world building, a number of questions. For example, another thing is that again, given the conditions of this world, you need to have a non-renewable source of iron, right? A renewable source, which is bog iron. It comes from bogs and swamps. Other sources are non-renewable. They exhaust themselves. The problem is that bog iron is extremely fragile and extremely weak. So if you want to make weapons, bog iron is going to bog iron swords are just going to break very easily. And then in the course of research, you find out stuff like, for instance, that the Vikings used to use, and the Vikings found this out quite by accident, that if you mix bone with bog iron, then the weapons become much stronger. And of course, bone is it will be available in this closed city as well. So then, so you can actually have proper weapons that don't break easily. It will be coherent, but you have to do the research to find out in what way they are, because bone mixed with bog iron will give you a stronger alloy. But of course, you can't have something like steel, because that wouldn't work. So in that sense, as questions start to raise themselves when you're doing your world building, step by step, you need to read nonfiction and do research to find out how to answer them. And depending on the level of detail that you want your world building to accomplish, which itself is a function of your premises, will determine the amount of research you do. So, I mean, certain kinds of of fantasy and science fiction writing do not require that kind of detailed world building. But something like The Wall, which is set in a closed system where, you literally have to ensure that all the resources required to survive are present in their correct quantities, you need to then do that kind of world building that will make that plausible. And then, of course, you have to go deeper and research more. So I think that's the interaction between the nonfiction reading that you do and the amount of what you do and the kind of reading that you do when you're writing science fiction or fantasy.
Wow, but that must have been quite a task, because right now you just gave me two examples, and I'm sure there must be like countless others when you were researching like for the book. So can you take us like along in terms of like some other challenges and all which you would have faced, and also like are there like specific books also which you refer to, or like specific material? For example, like I read earlier that you had mentioned Kenji Yoshino's Covering, which like helped you to understand, say, like same-sex couples. So in that, like, are there like other books also like that which you have like relied on, or like other things which you did in your research?
There are two things. I think the one thing is, as far as same-sex relations go, it's not enough to read. Like, you have to have the draft sensitivity read, and to ensure that you're not screwing up. And that's a basic element of like respect to experiences that you don't have, that you haven't experienced. I think that there are certain kinds of things for which it's not sufficient. It is important to read, but you also need to pass your draft and your book through people to know that that you're not screwing up and not being disrespectful. So that's one thing. Secondly, yeah, I mean, so I don't think you start with like a conscious plan, and really it's a lot to do with. I think it works in a kind of a circular way, in the sense that a lot of the reading that you do, the ideas you have for the novel come from that to start with. So for example, in The Wall, there is this entire structure of governance, which is the council. It's 300 councillors, and certain rules on property, and it's hard to alter those rules. So a lot of that comes from this English thinker called Harrington, and whom I happen to have read as part of reading history of political ideas. And when you're reading that, you say, oh, well, this is an interesting way of governance to explore, like in fiction. And so then you kind of base something on that. So a lot of it actually, when you are starting off your writing, you're already coming to it with a set of readings and a set of ideas that then transmute themselves into the book. And of course, as I said, as you're going along, there are things that then you need to, as you do the world building, there are questions that present themselves. So I'll give you an example of something that had a bit of both into it. So the color blue plays an important role in the book. The idea for that comes from the fact that back in the 17th or 18th centuries, blue pigment was very, very hard to obtain. And so if a painting of a great master or an old master had blue color in it, as some of, for example, Vermeer's paintings do, that signified that the patron or whoever commissioned that painting was like wealthy enough or rich enough to actually be able to procure blue pigment for the painting to be done, or the painter himself, or herself, occupy that kind of stature. So in that sense, the color blue becomes a symbol of status, a very important status, and you can tell by looking at which paintings have that in some of Vermeer's paintings. So that's for something I read before, and so I was like interested in how like how one specific color or color can become a symbol of hierarchy or status. So that entered the book. Now once I had done that, as I've said before, I needed to find a source of blue pigment that was self-pollinating. Indigo couldn't do it, others couldn't do it, and then I finally found out that the woad flower that was used, like is no longer used, but was used in medieval times as a source of blue pigment, is self-pollinating. Then I had to, of course, read up about like the woad flower and which climate does it like grow best in. Given that I'm talking about the city's weather, is that the right weather in which the woad flower can grow, and how to bring them in line with each other. So it's kind of like a constant process. You have some ideas that you put into practice, and then the constraints of the world building run up against those ideas, and you're kind of always bringing the two into harmony. And sometimes when they can't come into harmony, you have to just like bite the bullet and like drop the idea. So in that sense, it's like a continuous process. But there wasn't one specific book. I mean, so in book 2, The Horizon, there will be some incidents that are drawn from research that was very directed and specific, based on specific books, and we can talk about that maybe like in a few months. But for book 1, at least, there wasn't like one book, but there was just like a constant process of researching. One thing was I was a very early issue I knew that would come up would be, how do you dispose of dead bodies, in like a closed city? What do you do with that? And then I found that there's actually like this entire project in the US where you literally like put these bodies in like tars, and as they move down the level of the tars, they decompose bit by bit until by the time that they come down to the soil level, they have completely decomposed and are like part of the soil and can be used as fertilizer after that. And wood shavings are used to kind of accelerate that process. And then that became, I just needed to like, that was such an elegant solution that I just put that into the book as it was, because that is exactly how you would imagine in a closed system you would dispose of like corpses. So yeah, it was just like a constant process.
Wow. And I think that's what makes the book like very believable in a sense, like, because when I read the book, it didn't like seem like anything was out of place. So in fact, like, because you mentioned book 2, like one thing which I was wondering is like, did the process like how much of the process you think was complete when by the time you were done with book 1, you think like the majority of the world building was done, or you think like when you're like taking a narrative or like the story forward, there was still like lots of like holes which you had to plug in terms of like world building also? So how was like book 1 versus book 2 in terms of like
it was mostly done, because originally this was one book, and then the story just grew too big to be contained in one book. And the point at which book 1 ends was just the most convenient kind of breaking point between the two. Between the two. So I already knew how it was going to end. And the world building was done. In fact, book 2 is much more action. There's a lot more action in book 2, and a lot less like kind of deliberate world building. I mean, book 2 is much more like events and like that kind of thing happening. So yeah, the world building was done, but I think it's inevitable, and I think it happens to everyone, that when you're writing book 2, you're like, if only I had known I was going to do this, I would have done something else in book 1. I think that's inevitable, but thankfully it didn't happen like too often for me when I was writing book 2.
Okay. And like, because you're mentioning like when we're talking about world building, one thing which I was thinking is like, how exactly did the idea of the book come? Like from what I've seen, some people like to like have a world where like they tweak a couple of things and then like everything changes. So for you, was it that you imagined first that, okay, I want a world which is like closed or like semi-closed, where like there's a wall where nobody has gone through, or you were thinking of like other things in terms of, okay, what's a world like where nobody has seen a horizon or something like that, and then you came to the conclusion that, okay, I need a world where there's an enclosed wall to sort of have the story. So how did it go for you?
No, the wall came first. Like the wall came first, and it actually is inspired. I mean, it is inspired by Isaac Asimov's short story Nightfall, which, as you say, is all about the question of what happens if there is one thing that you take for granted so much that it's just so internalized, you don't even think about it. But what if that one thing wasn't there? So in Asimov's Nightfall, that is nightfall, because the planet has like, I think, 6 or 7 suns, and so night falls once in 2,500 years, and so generation upon generation has never seen stars, and it's always going to be like that one like blessed or cursed generation that like gets to see nightfall and gets to see stars. And how would you respond to nightfall if you'd never seen night before? So that was kind of the inspiration. And then there's something similar. How would you respond if there was a world in which everything was cut off by a wall, physically, and you'd never seen a horizon? So that's the inspiration. Like, the inspiration was that to do that thing. I think the most fascinating science fiction is that kind where you take like one thing, that is so obvious in our world, and take that away, and then just like explore how people would respond to that one thing not being there and never being there.
Yeah, that's in fact like very interesting also, because I remember like listening to this one podcast by Ezra Klein where he had N.K. Jemisin over, and they did a world building exercise. and that was very something like very similar, where like N.K. Jemisin was asking Ezra Klein what is it like that he'd like to change about the world, and he was like saying a couple of things, and then like in response to that, N.K. Jemisin was saying like 10 things about what the society would change compared to our world. So yeah, but like I think that's something which also like gives for like great like thought experiments and to like think about questions. So so here like I was thinking of one thing, like I read that this book has been like in the making for like almost a decade. So can you take us through that process in terms of like how exactly the story also evolves through multiple drafts? Like I think like the writing and structure definitely I think helps through multiple edits, but because like I've also seen that you plot your stories like extensively before writing. So I'm assuming you must have like thought through about like what the story would be before like writing it. So like how did like things change through like multiple drafts, and what has been like the process through the years? Can you take us through that?
Yeah, so I'll again answer that in two parts. So first is so at least for the Wall and the Horizon, I didn't plan it out beforehand. Like I was making it up as I went along. I've always been the kind of person who like just wants to start writing and figure it out, and as you write and let the story take you where it will. So I'm not like that detailed kind of advanced plotter. At least I'm now changing a bit now, because the next project I'm working on is a much more ambitious and then requires all kinds of storyboarding. So I am doing that now, but Wall and Horizon were written like in a kind of flow, in the sense that I didn't know what was happening next until it had happened. Yeah, I had a rough idea of how it would end. That was kind of always I knew how it would end, but how I was getting there, like that just evolved as the writing process went on. But you're right in that it did change significantly. So the first draft when I was in college, undergraduate in college, and then a second draft when I was postgraduate abroad. And I came back home and I was working, and I suspended it for like 5 or 6 years, and then came back to it. It changed a lot, and it changed a lot in a good way, I think, because my own reading and understanding of the genre changed like massively. I think that it's just like when you were growing up in the 1990s and the 2000s in India, the science fiction you had access to is basically from bookshops. And the science fiction that bookshops stocked, and I think this is also changing now. But back then, the books, the things they stocked were Isaac Asimov, Arthur Clarke, a bit of Ursula Le Guin, Gene Wolfe, a bit of Zelazny, basically like the 60s, 70s, 80s, like famous great writers, mostly white and mostly men. And this is not like, I don't want to get into that whole, I think they wrote some great stuff, and stuff that has stood the test of time. Some that hasn't, some that has, and it definitely, were the starting points of my journey. But because of who they were and where they were coming from, the perspective was obviously limited. So when I began writing, all my names were like classic, the kind of names you'd find in an Arthur Clarke or Asimov novel. Like it was the most of the characters were male. It was very in that mold, because that was the writing that I knew best. But like after college and more even after I joined Strange Horizons, and began to edit speculative fiction, just the how plural the genre was, I began to realize that, and once my reading changed and became much more, I had access to much more and read much more. Of course, it began to influence what I thought was important in world building and writing. And specifically, I think, and this is a point that Rick Riordan often makes, is that when you're world building, it's not that you are consciously aiming for like a representation quota, or like okay, checking boxes that you need to have like X or Y representation, but you should as at the minimum make sure that your world building reflects the depth and plurality of the world itself, and not one sliver of it or one segment of it. So then, and once you kind of bring that perspective, it changes. It becomes broader. It becomes more, it becomes more representative on its own, and so on. So the major change was that what I consciously did was to try and ensure that I wasn't operating with a blinkered perspective. I wasn't doing a narrow kind of like narrow form of world building, but trying to make it like in a sense reflective of the depth that's there in an actual world. So that sense changed, and as you can see now, the characters have changed, and the names have changed, and it is different in that way.
Yeah, and like when you talk about like this plurality of world building, like one thing which came to mind is like taking back to your earlier point about like how most people who are science fiction writers or like any writers have a day job, and what they do in the day job like seeps into what they're doing in fiction. Like I remember there was recently an interview of Arundhati Roy where she said that her training as an architect has embedded the idea of like structure and design into like whatever she's thinking, be like fiction, non-fiction, or the documentaries which she's made earlier. So now, and you also mentioned that you're working on a bigger project right now, which I think like is a space opera. So in that also, do you think that this idea of like a legal world building is something which is like implicit or explicit, and which like comes naturally to you because of your legal training? And is that something which like you're seeing in your like fiction writing as like you're writing more and more now?
The space opera will be a world without law, thankfully. So, like, the question won't even arise. I'd like to say how people say this is a legal science fiction novel when there's no law in it at all. Like the law doesn't exist. So we'll see about that. But no, to answer it more seriously, yeah, no, I mean, as I said, like it's an internalized thing. I mean, it's just like as in the architecture example. Once you see it, you can't unsee it. You know, and that's true for whatever like discipline you're in. So if you're a lawyer, you can't unsee how legal structures underpin social behavior, and inevitably it will play a part in your world building. Yeah, I think like the challenge, and I think the challenge is that like it shouldn't like come out as like as something that's deliberately been put there, right? Like consciously been put there. So it needs to be it needs to be invisible. That's the mark of having like successfully done that. Because again, like law is something that's always there, like in in our daily lives, but except in like specific circumstances, we don't notice it on a daily basis unless that's our job. So similarly, I think with science fiction and world building, you have to be like careful to ensure that that your that kind of the day job is not something that you're kind of just transplanting into your fiction, but to find a way to to that your world building reflects that and therefore is like a richer world for it, but isn't just like kind of regurgitating it in a certain sense.
Yeah, but I'm just curious, like, how does like a lawless world work? And like, I know multiple instances how people would want to do a legal analysis of that. But like,
Oh,
leaving that, how does a
there's a whole history of like anarchist thought on how like, a world would look without centralized authority. Like law is centralized authority, and there's like 3 centuries of anarchist thought going into detail about how that would look like. For the rest, you'll have to wait for a while.
Yeah, and like a couple of novels which come to mind, I think like The Dispossessed also has at some level like
Yeah.
this idea, even like The Moon is a Harsh Mistress. So in that there also like I was seeing like some books in which the legal world building is like very explicit in terms of, for example, the kind of laws which say which are there in terms of like say corporations can own human beings or things like that. So and I think that's somewhat of a genre also which I don't know, like I haven't heard about much, but I think is like up and coming in terms of the legal science fiction or like legal SFF. So like, what are your thoughts about like that genre?
I mean, I think that like as I said, like law is like a really important part of the world, right? And there's a lot of science fiction you can do, using law. I mean, just to take an example, I I I think this is Annalee Newitz's book Autonomous. I think that's the one. And Cory Doctorow's Walk Away. Walk Away. Yeah, Walk Away. Yeah. Both are have a lot to do with intellectual property and how intellectual property, is basically used to exclude, a range of people and kind of entrenched corporate dominance over the world. And so that's like perfectly like good science fiction that's really grounded in like one branch of like of law. So I think that like it's very much something worth exploring. But like I said, ultimately you're telling a story, and to the extent that law and legal systems contribute to the story you're telling, it's great. But yeah, I would be hesitant to like explicitly call something like legal science fiction. Like it's science fiction that is informed by what law does in the world.
Okay. And like one thing which I was also interested in is how has like your writing changed in terms of, because like law and like legal writing is supposed to be like very terse and very like dry to the point, but like fiction is something which is completely different. So one, I wanted to ask that how was like the process of switching, but like one more thing which I was interested in is like now that you've completed your first book, do you think that your writing and like lawyering generally also has changed? And like the reason I'm asking this is because recently like Philip Sands was saying that because he wrote like two books on like creative nonfiction, which was like Ratline and East West Street, he said that his entire idea of like telling a story even when he was like giving a brief or like arguing in front of court, like that changed completely. So has that been a similar process for you also? And like how has like generally the writing journey been?
So answer second question, no, like there's genuinely like no, I don't see like any connection between writing fiction and like what you do in court. Like they're just like two completely different worlds, and I don't, at least for me, I mean, like I don't like, I'm not really in the stage of my career where I like argue much, but I mean, even if slash when I did, like I kind of don't think that fiction writing is going to, I just, they're two very different worlds. On the question of writing, yeah, I mean, you have to unlearn a whole bunch of things to write fiction, and I think that's true for any kind of non-fiction to fiction transition. And the only answer really is to edit, get beta reads, get it torn apart by like your editor, do it again, and keep doing it until like it reads like non-fiction, like fiction and not like non-fiction.
So like can you tell some instances about like what are like some specific things which you think like change in your writing in terms of like maybe structure? Was it like using
Yeah,
too
no,
many
of
like
course. I mean,
jargons or adverbs?
I mean, the very obvious thing is that in nonfiction, it's always the written voice. So when you start off writing fiction after nonfiction, you tend to write your dialogues as if they were written and not spoken. And it for me at least, it took a lot of effort to make my dialogues resemble something like human speech. And I think I'm still not quite there yet. Like, and some of the critiques of the book, I think valid ones, have been that a lot of the dialogue still sounds like it's written speech. So that's just one like very prominent example of the kind of mental switch you have to make when you're doing the transition.
Okay. And like because you were also mentioning like Cory Doctorow and like other writers. So
Yeah.
it's like another thing which has been like there in like science fiction and fantasy. At some level, it's also been like a battleground of I think like political ideology in terms of like some authors. Like I think you shared about like Chandler Davis and how like he was somebody who wasn't given like a lot of space in terms of like science fiction magazines. So is that something which you think like is changing right now in terms of like our people from like different ideologies like being given more voice, or do you think it's still like a genre which has like a lot of gatekeepers in like a particular ideology?
So give me 1 second. I'm getting wet in the rain. I'm gonna find a dry place. Like just give me like 2 seconds.
Sure. Yeah, meanwhile, I see there are a couple of questions in the chat. I'll like ask them soon. And if you have like more questions and all, or like anything, any comments, anything which you'd like to contribute, please feel free.
Stop by now.
Yeah, can you hear me?
Yeah.
Sorry, I'm now dry. Yeah. So I think that it is changing in the sense that science fiction in the 1940s and 50s was pretty explicitly quite right wing in its orientation, anti-labor, and so on. So that's obviously changing. But I think that the issue more is that because science fiction is so dominated by America as a center of power when it comes to publishing, audience, and so on, it still reflects like a lot of the preoccupations in the US at any given point. So if like at any given point in the US, like anti-colonial is the buzzword, you suddenly have like 20 books that are apparently anti-colonial, which you have to read because I mean that's they're the ones that are being pushed by by publishers and marketed and so on, even though that may not be where other countries are at or other science fiction communities are at. So in that sense, I think that the problem is less of ideological gatekeeping and more like this is a market that is completely dominated by like Americans, and so like the gatekeeping becomes what people think will sell in the American market, and then that's determined by whatever is happening there at that time, what the social justice vocabulary there at any given time prioritizes, and I think I think that's where the issue is right now. Again, just like what we may think of as anti-colonial based on our history is very different from the salience the words acquired, say, in the US right now. But that is what becomes like the version of anti-colonial science fiction. So I think the problem is more there, and this could be really helped by a more conscious geographical diversity, in addition to all the other kinds of diversity that are very rightly being given importance right now.
Okay. And in terms of you talk about how still America is the center and what sells there becomes in terms of the dominant kind of books which are being published. But you think is that changing because after say the three body problem, everyone has been saying that there's been a kind of Chinese upsurgence, and I think now everyone is sort of looking to China that okay, will India also have a three body problem moment or things like that. So you think that that this idea of the American dominance that's changing because more fiction is being published, for example, other things also which come to mind, there are less, but in terms of say African SFF and what's being published there. So do you think that are these things which are having a substantial impact in your opinion?
Yeah, I think the impact is there. It's a bit slow, but it's there, and it is changing. The extent to which it changes over time is still something that we'll have to see.
Okay. And in this, where do you see the Indian SFF stand, and what has been your take about? Because in the past couple of years, it's definitely been growing. So, and as somebody who's been involved in the genre for such a long time, what is your take about the way Indian SFF is moving forward?
Yeah, I think it's been good. And, you have Samit Basu, who recently got a contract with Tor for the city, the Chosen Spirits, which is it'll be called The City Within when it's published in the US. So that was a pretty big kind of deal, right? A pretty big thing. And you had, of course, Lavanya Lakshminarayan's Analog Virtual that was published last year, which is presently on the Locus shortlist for best collection. And you have a number of other things. So my friend Prashant Srivastava was written a fantastic novel called Spice Gate, is now represented by a very big agent in the US. And I'm looking forward to seeing his novel coming out soon. So I think that in that sense there is a shift in the sense that that until a while ago, there's obviously, and so I mean, first of all, I think it's Indian science fiction in English, because of course we have a long tradition of science fiction in Marathi, in Bengali and all that. So this is limited to science fiction in English. And while the writing's always been there, it's still kind of it's been hard to get it actually before a non-Indian audience, and in strange ways that has an impact even on Indian audiences. So there's this thing where many Indian readers, and this includes so when I was growing up reading science fiction, right? So I mean it was basically what was there on the bookshelf. And what was there on the bookshelf was these books published by these big American publishing houses, right? So it's even that once these American publishing houses take up these kinds of novels and these books, and then they come back into the Indian market via these American publishing houses. And this sounds very ironic, but I think it's true. They will find an even greater audience in India, because there's kind of seal of validity or legitimation that comes. Okay, now Tor US has published X or Y book. Orbit has published it. that is like clearly it means it's good, whether it's HarperCollins India or like Penguin India or something. Yeah, okay, well, we'd still rather read like, the Tor book. So I think that once that starts to happen, and it seems to be in progress, we may have, we may have this thing where Indian science fiction, Indian fantasy, which is not always myth-based fantasy, uh, develops an identity of its own, and like people begin to talk about Indian writers when you talk about like what's happening in science fiction, right? So right now, when you're talking about like what's happening in science fiction, you do get a lot of like, oh, like Chinese SFF, like in fact, the latest Vector issue of the British Science Fiction Academy is like Vector magazine, is entirely about Chinese science fiction. And you also say, okay, like African science fiction from African countries, like XYZ countries, is like, so it's part of the conversation. We aren't quite there yet, but I think that once, maybe in a few years' time, once this happens, then it could be that when people say, okay, what's happening in science fiction? Okay, there are Indian writers, who are doing interesting things.
Yeah, let's hope that happens, and that happens soon. So like it's great that you're mentioning like regional SFF also. So like have you like read any like, or like do you like read regional SFF also?
When I was growing up, there was a bunch of interesting Hindi SFF. I remember Antariksh ke Vyapari and things like that. Like books that were very, very interesting, and they were entirely in Hindi. But I think they kind of disappeared after a point. But I did read like very fascinating science fiction in Hindi when I was growing up. Yeah, I don't know if it was part of like a tradition that is there like in say Marathi or in Bengali, but there were books that existed, and involved like space travel and time travel and stuff. Yeah.
Yeah, and what were some of the first like English SFF novels which you remember reading?
Oh yeah, I mean, with respect to fantasy, The Hobbit was the book that my parents got for me when I was like in class 5 or 6. With respect to science fiction, it was Foundation. And my parents had this kind of like big book of like classic science fiction from 1930s and 40s that had, that famous and in high roads must roll and a lot of other stuff. So that was my introduction to science fiction. After that, gradually I went on to Arthur Clarke, Childhood's End. Childhood's End was my first Arthur Clarke, and then The Dispossessed and The Left Hand of Darkness, and then moved on from there.
Okay. So like right now we're talking about like publishing. Also, one thing which I was wondering is that like the first book came out during the pandemic. So like how different was that an experience in like when like your book is coming out in the middle of an event which happens like once in 100 years. So like what was that experience like, and can you tell us like something about that?
Yeah, I mean, I guess it's just that there were no bookshop events, and so it had to be all done online. And I think that like a lot of the burden of publicity came on the author because there were no actual physical events where you could sign books and like talk and spread the word about the book in bookshops and things like that. So I think that just that a lot of the burden then came on the author, and I guess also for obvious reasons, as pandemic on, like buying fantasy or science fiction is not really like priority, right? So you also feel a little guilty about doing too much publicity because bigger things in the world right now. So you're kind of navigating that equation a little bit. But I think that was the main thing in the sense that the absence of like actual like events around the book, that absence was felt a little bit.
Yeah, and I hope that changes in the like second book. Any idea when the second book is going to like?
It's due in September.
Like, India particularly.
It's due in September. And I would love to like have an event at Champaka. I love that bookshop. And I would love to have an event there if we're not in the third wave at enough time, and if it's possible at all. So yeah. But as of now, the date that my publisher has given me is September, and I guess until further notice, that is, I guess, the date. It's the date, yeah.
Okay. Yeah, and hopefully we'll have an event with Mithila also. One question I was wondering is like, did like the Mithila Review inspire the name of the protagonist in any way, or are these two unrelated?
No. That just comes from Mithila, comes from Earth, right? So given the importance of like like Earth, in some sense, to the book. That was the basis of the name. I think it's a happy coincidence that the name of the magazine is the name of the main character. I think it's a great thing. Yeah, separate process of reasoning that led me to that name. Yeah.
Yeah, and I think there are a couple of like Indian mythological references also, right? In terms of, because like the story of Garud and Samati. I think
Yeah.
that's something which is there, which is
that's Jatayu from the Ramayana.
Yeah, and surprisingly, that's also there in like the story of Icarus and Daedalus. So
yeah, I think it's really interesting, and in the sense that how similar myths exist across cultures. Right? No, I think the Jatayu Sampati story in Ramayana is so much richer for me than Icarus. Because there's a lot more going on in the Jatayu story than in the Icarus story. But yeah, I mean, so there are those few references. And I think again, it's just interesting that when you're growing up in India in the 1990s, on the one hand, you have all these tales of Greek mythology, Roger Lancelot Green's, stories version of Greek mythology. So you really get exposed to Greek myth, and by virtue of being in the Commonwealth and so on, right? So there are all those books. At the same time, of course, inevitably Ramayana and Mahabharata are like always going to be a part of growing up. That's just the way it is. It's and so you end up, this kind of hybrid hybrid influences end up informing your work. And I think that's very interesting, for me at least, that actually in the original draft of the story, the Garuda Samati story was much closer to the actual Icarus story, the Greek one. And in the course of evolution, I realized that it looked like the Ramayana one is actually more interesting and more poignant and more moving, because it actually involves somebody saving somebody else, and not like the hubris kind of thing of flying too close to the sun, but it actually involves like two people, and there's a relationship happening over there. So I decided to take that fable more towards that direction. But I think it's pretty wonderful how we have access to both those sets of tools when we're thinking of world building and writing and role of myths in our work.
Yeah, and like one thing which was really fascinating for me for like while I was reading The Wall is that how much like of context there was in terms of like the city of Sumer had its own like myths, had its own like history, culture, and all. So in that also, like one thing I was recently reading an interview saying that how some of like India's actual politicians have for example, the role of Sanchika was something which was there from like Kerala's first like communist chief minister. So are there like more instances like that? Because like while I thought that lots of things made sense in some ways where I could place it in history, for example, like 300 senators was something which I think even like Romans had, and like the idea that only propertied class can be a senator. So are there like more instances like that which are there and have like derived more from like actual instances which has happened in history?
Yeah, there are a lot of them, and you'll see like a glossary in the finest of Tolkien traditions. There's going to be an appendix at the end of book 2, which will set out all the references. I'll give you a couple of examples. So there is a huge issue about land in Sumer, right? Like it's a city within a wall. So there's always going to be a question of who owns the scarce land and how that control is exercised, because that will be a source of political power. And there's a conflict in the book about trying to change the way land is owned and controlled to redistribute power, and that comes from, as you I think spotted, Roman history. So in ancient Rome, the tribune, and there was the brothers Gracchus, who proposed this kind of complete redistribution of land, and then there was a massive conflict. So the character of Sanchika is drawn from Gracchus. His name is drawn from Nambudri, but that's one influence. And there are quite a few more scattered around, around the book, and you'll see what they are, when book 2 comes out. It's going to be like a full detailed appendix that sets out those influences.
Okay, but I just like to say we won't mind any spoilers. So just saying, not asking you to give any, but
I mean, it's not a spoiler, but there's a song about the color blue in The Wall, and that's inspired by Federico Garcia Lorca's very famous poem, Verde que te quiero verde, which translates to green, I want you green. So that kind of the rhythm is based on that, and of course, like Federico Garcia Lorca was like a really important left-wing slash, Spanish Republican kind of history there. So there are things of that kind that are scattered around the book a little bit.
Wow. Yeah, that's actually like very interesting. And one thing I was wondering is like, do you also like write poetry, because like there's so many songs in the book? So
to the extent that
so
there
like
is
generally
poetry
have
in the
you?
book, to the extent, yes. Otherwise, I mean, sometimes, but not very often.
Okay. Yeah. And like another thing which I remember,
And I mean,
because
of
like
course,
you're
like the
talking
whole
about.
idea of poetry in books.
No, sorry, go ahead. I think there was a
Yeah,
lag
no, I
in
was
the
saying
internet.
that the whole idea of like of poetry as being part of the story is again like very Tolkien inspired, and like, I think like honestly it's hard to. I think all of us have moved past Tolkien in many ways, but it's just impossible to overstate the kind of impact that Tolkien had on just how he imagined writing science fiction or fantasy, and in so many unspoken ways, and poetry in the book being one, very striking way in which that impact took place.
Okay. Yeah. And like a couple of instances which I was wondering in if I have got them. For example, like Mithila always says that the wall must like be breached because it's there. And I was reading that that's something which like which George Mallory also said when like he
Yeah,
was, I think, one of the first people to try to climb the Everest.
yeah,
So is
yeah.
it like
That comes from George Mallory saying that, when asked why do you want to climb Mount Everest, he said because it's there. So that's a doff of the hat to Mallory. Yeah.
Okay. And also like there are also like multiple instances of like 1,000-year project. So that also seems like what like people say in terms of if you want like a post-capitalist society or a communist society, then that's like a 1,000-year long project. So is that something which, because you also
No,
explore the idea of freedom and
there's one reference to 1,000-year project, and that actually is an intertextual reference to Jean Genet's Prisoner of Love, which is a book about Palestine. And the context there is that Genet is with the Palestinian freedom fighters, and they're like basically talking about the importance of not letting the Palestinian freedom movement get overrun by religion, and the need to keep it like secular. This is back in the 70s. Of course, things have changed a lot since then. And Genet is recording a discussion between like the freedom fighters, and one of them says, "Yeah, if you want to like get rid of religion, it'll take 1,000 years." And the other one says, "Well, then let's start right now. We have no time to lose." So that's like it's a bit of again a tip of the hat to that dialogue. That isn't about capitalism, but the other things are, but not that.
okay. And even like this idea of smara, which is there in the book, and also like how some people have this like memory, or like earlier in the book it comes off as a yearning of a time before the wall. So like is it because that reminded me a lot about like Westworld and how like those AI had like reveries after they were put back after being like programmed. So is there like
I have
any
not seen.
reference
I have
there
not.
to? Okay, okay.
I do not know of Westworld. But this was just a basic exploration of memory. I mean, it's which writers have done for a long time. So there was no deeper kind of intertextual stuff happening over there.
Yeah, and like in the previous answer, you would mention that how like there are like other things which say talk about like the material structure in the society. So like one thing which was like really fascinating to me, which was the concept of like family, and how like in how like one of the essays because of which she got suspended from school, she like, sorry, I'm forgetting the Malika, I'm forgetting the character's name.
Mankala, yeah, Mankala,
Ah,
yeah,
Mankala, I'm so sorry. Yeah.
yeah,
So,
yeah, yeah.
so she'd written that how like because there's no need of a family structure for something like for a city like Sumer, and therefore the fact there's a family structure shows of a time like before the wall. So can you tell a little about that in terms of like how like you see material structures changing things like family, and how this entire
Yeah,
idea
no,
of
I mean,
pure union
there's
also?
nothing. Yeah, there's nothing very particularly deep going on over there. It's just more of more like just an understanding that again, like the structures that we take as immutable in our lives are actually very contingent. Even though they are they're very strongly entrenched and very difficult to move or to alter, but they're still contingent, and they're contingent upon like material reality, and if the material reality was different, they would be different. So that of course plays into how do you try to change things and so on. That's just like kind of just I wasn't thinking too deeply anything of anything over there. It was more just to like another example of just like everything else. The family itself is a contingent structure that has emerged in a very specific historical context, and therefore is not inevitable when you think of the future as well.
Okay. And in terms of like other themes also which you want to like explore in terms of like say the concept of time, that was something which I found very interesting, which was about like the circular concept versus the linear concept of time, and even like things like language where you don't have certain words and things like if you want to write down history. So in that, like what are some of your like if you had to pick some themes which are your favorite which you explore in the book, are there like any such which are like really close to you?
I think the big one is language and the role language plays in not just reflecting the world but constituting it. And there's a fantastic book called Through the Language Glass that really treats this very well. And it begins with the famous phrase from Homer, the wine dark sea. And basically like whatever else the sea's color, it's not the color of wine. So what's happening when Homer says wine dark sea? Why is he saying wine? And then when you do some research, you find that on the Greek color spectrum, the Greek color spectrum was not our color spectrum. So whatever color they attributed to the sea and to wine was within the same band, same color band. Whereas so basically violet, indigo, blue, green, yellow, orange, and red are not the only ways in which you can divide the color spectrum. And so depending on how you divide the color spectrum, that depends on that influences how you see the world and how you describe it, right? And so that's like really fascinating. So that's like one theme that I explore, and the other is this whole thing of oral history, written history, and that comes from the Albanian writer Ismail Kadare, who I think is one of the greatest contemporary writers, and in many of his books, such as The File on H, Palace of Dreams, he really explores like what it means when you abandon an oral kind of culture and take a written culture. The idea of there being one original version of each work being an output of a written culture, whereas in an oral culture there's no concept of the original, because every time you're doing an oral performance you are recreating the work anew, and how this idea of the original therefore really kind of becomes a cage, in a conceptual cage, and things like that. So that's another theme that I've tried to explore a little bit in the book, and maybe a little bit more in the next one.
Okay, and like, are there any more themes which you're like exploring in book 2, or is it like a conclusion?
You'll find out. When it comes out, you'll find out. So okay. Yeah, I mean, but no, there's nothing fundamentally new. Like it's kind of taking forward these themes in new ways, but it's not going to be like some completely a new concept in book 2.
Yeah, and like because you like talked about how your like work in terms of like how your perception of fiction changed after you started working for like Strange Horizons. So I see that you've recently like become the coordinating editor at Strange Horizons. Like first of all, congratulations on that. But and like Strange Horizons has been like publishing some really great and diverse work in SFF. So I wanted to ask in terms of like vision and like where do you see Strange Horizon going in the next few years? Like what exactly do you have in mind?
Strange Horizons is a very anarchic magazine in the sense that the several departments have their own autonomy. So Strange Horizons publishes short fiction, poetry, reviews, and non-fiction on a weekly basis. Non-fiction once a month, others on a weekly basis. And the coordinating editor's task is basically, it's not like some hugely powerful position as it may sound like. It's just ensuring that like there is coordination between the departments, and there's no like any good anarchist like collective. There's no like central authority, but as anarchists accept, you need coordination to ensure that things actually happen. So the coordinating editor basically coordinates and ensures that every Monday the issue is published, and it actually comes out, and that everyone's like on time and things like that. So I wouldn't say I have a vision for the magazine. Like the magazine has its own identity, which is, to actively seek out diversity in every sense, including geographical diversity. We do special issues in various geographical regions. Palestine was the latest one in May, and that'll continue. So it'll just basically be, the vision is to ensure that the science fiction and fantasy reflects the plural character of our world in as much a way as we can do on our in our weekly issues.
Yeah. And like in terms, like when we talk about like these magazines, so like what exactly do you see the role of like a literary magazine or like a science fiction magazine in particular in terms of like expanding the genre? That's like one question I had. And like a related question I had is, for example, I remembered reading when like Stephen King in his book on writing had talked about that how like the idea of like short stories like slowly dying, and a lot of people like view short story as a stepping stone to say something bigger, which is like mostly like a novel. So in that, like where exactly do you see the role of like short stories in like any genre, and particularly like where do you place like these short fiction or like short story magazines in like propagating or proliferating that genre?
I think on the first question, the role of a good science fiction magazine is twofold. One is to introduce readers to new writers who don't already have huge platforms where they can push their work. So that's like one very important task. To ensure that new voices are actually heard. And the second is, of course, to introduce readers to the depth and the breadth and the range of what exists. So to be representative in that sense. So range of stories from a range of contributors across the world. And that also happens in our reviews, to review books from across the world, to make sure that books not published in the US and the UK, not published by Tor, Orbit, Harper, and so on, also are given a hearing in these magazines and things like that. So I think that these are the tasks of a good magazine. As far as short stories go, I'm probably not the best person to answer that because I've just written like a couple and I'm not really like a regular short story writer. But I think that at least in science fiction and fantasy, short story is pretty much well and alive because of all these magazines and because of how the awards each year, the Nebulas, the Hugos, and so on, have categories for short story, short fiction. So there is a lot of focus every year on good short fiction appearing in all these magazines. So I think that at least as far as science fiction and fantasy goes, that is pretty much alive and well. And in fact, the Chinese anthologies of science fiction and fantasy, are like doing very well. And for a lot of people, those anthologies have been, along with Six in Liu, have been the introduction to Chinese SFF. So I think that's like a good thing.
Yeah. And like because you mentioned that you straight away like jumped into a novel in terms of like, because I think a lot of people like try to like write like short stories beforehand or like publish them before like committing themselves to a bigger project. So like one in terms of like advice for people who are writing or trying to get themselves published, because like when you're working on like any story or like any novel in particular, then because like the process is so long and like so taxing that a lot of times like people lose faith in the story and they think that whether it's worth it or not, like at the end of the day, because of so many like redrafts, re-edits. So in terms of that, do you like, is there any advice or something which has like helped you like ground yourself more that okay, this is the story which I'm going to like focus on and work on no matter like what's happening, mainly like for people who haven't like published before?
I mean, I don't think there's been any specific advice. I think it's just that you have to sit at the desk and some days the words will not come, and then you should be easy on yourself and not be hard on yourself and come back the next day. At some point the words will come, but it's important to be at the desk. And of course, I mean, I know that this is easier said than done. Writing doesn't pay for most of us at day jobs. I'm not saying that, oh yeah, okay, there's something wrong with you if you're not like sitting at the desk every day for so and so hours, but I'm just saying that it's ultimately a question of like keeping at it and not being hard on yourself and it's not coming, but just to keep at it until it comes. This is the writing process. I mean, the publishing all is a whole different set of things, and let's not go there. But as far as writing and finishing like a book goes, I think it's just about two things. I said one is about being at the desk, and secondly, not like being hard on yourself if it's not happening.
Yeah. So like there's one thing which I've seen like a lot of people wonder in terms of like this idea of being at the desk is like how do you find the time to do it in terms of, because I see you being involved in like so many things that in terms of like your legal work or in terms of your sales horizons work or in terms of like your novel and all. So how do you like balance that and find the time to do all of these things?
I have a Word document where I like have a list of things to that month that I should be doing, and just divide up the weeks into where just like put things into like slots and then try and stick to it. So I think it's just a question of having it all kind of as a map in a good fantasy and science fiction way, like a map in front of you that you can navigate through.
And like because like we were also talking about publishing, so do you see like a big change in terms of like how you approach your novel once you are published? Because like this is something which I've read that a lot of people once they get published, it's that there's some sort of like a standard which they think that they have to like be at because of praise and all this they receive for the book. So do you think that there was in some ways like more pressure on you while writing the book, or did it become like easier once you were like working on the second book?
I mean, I am not some Tor published author who gets like 5,000 two reads on Goodreads, right? Like, I mean, maybe authors who sell like 50,000 copies in their first month, maybe they have those kinds of feelings of pressure because of all the praise they're getting. I don't think that really applies to at least like people like me. I think what I will say is that if you're focusing, I do look at critiques and comments about book one, and there are a range of critiques that I take seriously about like the weaknesses flaws in the book, and I try to see how in the next book I'm addressing those kinds of critiques and flaws. So to that extent, I think your approach is informed by the reaction to a previous book. But that's about it. I mean, I think the concerns you're mentioning are like stratospheric kind of concerns for people who have like six-figure advances and are like aggressively marketed by their publishers and so on. It's not for like regular people and regular writers.
Okay. No, because, like I don't know this. I remember reading for somebody who was like, in fact, I think writing the second book only. So that's what I thought that is this maybe something which like all authors go through. So, so and also there was this like one question. I know that you don't want to give spoilers. But there was one thing which like people on the Zoom forum had asked that who are the voices in the dark? Would you want to like share, or is
you'll
it something
find out? You'll find
we'd
out.
have to wait for the second book to come?
You'll find out.
This is not my question. This is a question which was there in the Zoom form. So.
Okay, the question
Yeah,
will
I'm
be
all
answered.
for like
The
reading
question
the
will
book
be
when it
answered.
comes out. So
I can tell you the question will be answered.
Okay. We have one question in the chat box. So Tarun Saint has asked that Gautam the Wall is a high concept science fiction and fantasy book. Were there influences as you shaped your that has shaped your writing style, Le Guin, Adam Robert, perhaps? Secondly, is the blurring of boundaries between SF and fantasy here to stay, and is the fusion of forms leading to incoherence or productive possibilities across the globe?
Yeah, I mean, Le Guin is a big influence. Dispossessed is a massive influence on the book and on my worldview generally. So Asimov was an influence. Le Guin was an influence for sure. Blurring of boundaries. So I think that the boundaries have always been blurred, right? I mean, again, just go back to the Dispossessed. Like, is it or the Hamish cycle, right? Or the Word for World is Forest? Is it science fiction? Is it like social science fiction? Is it like sciencey fantasy? Like, what is it, right? So I mean, I think that I think beyond the point, the terminological debates don't really help us. So they help us to an extent, but okay, Lord of the Rings is epic fantasy, right? Fine. You have like hard science fiction books, Rama series, Ringworld, you have, and some of Doctor Ro's books. You have hard science fiction. Again, hard is not really a good word, but you have books where the element of like the physical sciences are dominant. So you have books of that kind. But there's a whole range of books books that don't conform. Like, is A Memory Called Empire, is that science fiction, or it's something else? Like, it's actually, I mean, it is set on a planet. It does have some science fiction-y concepts, like the Imago machine, like an outworld mining planet. But at the same time, a lot of it is exploring the social dynamics of that civilization, the Exiclani Empire. Right? Is ancillary justice, like, is that science fiction, or is it something else? So I think that in some cases it gives you a good indication of what the book's going to be about, but there is such a huge spectrum in the middle. I don't even think that there exist those boundaries. I mean, the boundaries are there, but only the extremes. And for a lot of work, the question doesn't even admit of one answer. So I think that the question could be a good starting point, but that's about it.
And Pritish has said that Robert Sawyer's Mind Scan is kind of a legal science fiction book, which is quite interesting.
I will read it.
So, yeah. And for people who are watching us on Zoom and YouTube, if you have any questions, please feel free to ask them. And Gautam, we had a short rapid fire of a couple of questions. Would you want to take that? And
I can't guarantee an answer, but if I can, I'll answer it.
Okay, but there's only one thing. Please answer within 5 seconds, so you know what's your first instinct. So,
Okay.
So should we go ahead?
Sure.
The first question is which one would you choose, Ursula Le Guin or Seth Dickinson?
That is a fundamentally unfair question, and I refuse to answer that.
Okay. Later, if you want to answer it after thinking, you can always answer. But
no, I mean, whoever asked it knows me very, very clearly. So yeah.
Okay, so the second question is, which character would you pick, Taraf or Savarian?
Taraf. I always prefer the poets, like the the action man.
Yeah. If you could choose the Indian Constitution or your favorite science fiction book, which one would you choose?
My favorite science fiction book, for sure. Science fiction was part of my life way before law, and it'll be part of my life way after law. So yeah.
Okay, so that brings to the next question. If you didn't have a full-time, if you don't need to have a full-time job, would you then write full-time, or would you still want to practice law?
I think it's a
be related to
question.
The law.
No, I think that's a good question, and I think the answer is that I mean, I just feel like when you're writing, the writing has to come from somewhere, right? And I mean, there have been wonderful full-time writers, and so clearly it's full-time writing is just you can be a great full-time writer, but I just feel like I'll need to be anchored in some way to doing something that is not writing, to have experiences that can then inform writing. So I think that I think that full-time writing would just would feel a little incomplete for me. So I would be doing something else that is not just writing, which would inform the writing.
Okay. And the last question is that if you could take 2 books with yourself on a year-long vacation, and only those 2 books which you could read then for the next year, so which one would those be? Any fiction, non-fiction?
Yeah, The Dispossessed and The Theatre Barrow Covenant. It was Le Guin and Seth Dickinson.
Okay.
So, yeah.
You finally answered, I think, the first question as well. So.
Well, it's both. So yeah.
Okay, so and this is the last question which I have. If there are any more questions, then please feel free to put them in the chat box. But I just wanted, because you read so widely in terms of fiction, non-fiction, what are some of the book recommendations which you would have, say for people who are just starting reading science fiction in terms of Indian science fiction, or fiction across the globe, or any non-fiction also which you think is very interesting and has helped you shape your thinking a lot. So what would be those book recommendations?
I think global science fiction and fantasy. If you're looking for good entry points into the genre, Yeah, I mean, I think that you really can't go wrong if you start with Ursula Le Guin. Whether it is for fantasy Earthsea, the Earthsea Quartet, or for science fiction, The Left Hand of Darkness, although there are controversial parts of that, or The Dispossessed, or The Word for World is Forest. So I think there's an entry point, like for me, like that, really. Yeah, I mean that Ursula Le Guin shows you like the imaginative potential of the genre and what it is about the genre that is so wonderful. So I would also say that for somebody who's new, that those were and most of those books, with the possible exception of The Left Hand of Darkness, have aged, I think, pretty well. So I would say that. But again, I think I would also ask then that person, okay, are you looking for like, intricate world building? Are you looking for like quick paced action? So, and I mean, if so, then like Cory Doctorow, again, there's a great entry point. Very accessible science fiction, very contemporary, very quick, great sense of pacing. So yeah, so I think it would depend. As far as recommending nonfiction, so I just say mostly what you've read recently, right? So I read two fantastic books recently. One is called Entangled Life, by Martin Sheldrake. It's about how fungi shape our world, and the ways in which fungi kind of are part of the ecosystem, and it has at least 20 ideas that you could use for science fiction. So it's fantastic. And the other one is Fossil Capital by Andreas Malm, which is like the history of coal and how the history of coal is kind of integrated into the history of capitalism. Again, very accessible, a very good book.
Yeah. And what are some other like science fiction books or like fantasy which you've been like reading recently and like have enjoyed a lot, apart from Seth Dickinson's Theatre World Corman series?
I read that a year or so ago, so it's no longer really recent. Recently, okay. I read Adrian Tchaikovsky's The Shards of Earth, which is a good book. Although I think that The Doors of Eden, which I read previously, is like a wonderful book, which I read last year, late last year. So I would definitely recommend Adrian Tchaikovsky in general, and I would recommend The Doors of Eden in particular, as as genuinely like excellent science fiction. What else have I been? Recently science fiction. Yeah, I'm just mine's a blank for some reason, but yeah, no, I'll have to just like go and look at my Goodreads list and then yeah, I think like it's just like it's blurring right now. So like I can't recall what I've read recently. What I've read like a fair while back. So I will check and then get back to you on that. But I would definitely recommend Tchaikovsky's Doors of Eden.
Okay, sure. So if there are
also I read the sequel to Memory Called Empire, Desolation Called Peace, and the duology is quite good, and I would recommend that duology as like a very solid set of two books on I wouldn't say that second one's more of a space opera, but the two together form like a very good science fiction duology.
Yeah, and like I also like while reading your book, I was thinking of like A Memory Called Empire also, because I think in terms of how it plays with like language and poetry, like I saw like some parallels, so quite interesting to see.
Yeah, no, I think there are some commonalities in the approach towards world building in the two books. Yeah.
And like for people who've joined us, if there are like more questions, please put in the chat box and we'll ask Gautam. Just check YouTube also if there are any comments there. So thank you so much, Gautam, for doing this. This was a lot of fun, and I hope that like we meet soon once your second book is out. And for people who are joining us and haven't checked out Gautam's book, and for people like who are joining us here on Zoom or who are watching us on YouTube, if you haven't picked up Gautam's book, like please pick it up. It's a really nice and engaging book, The Wall, and I'm sure like you'll really enjoy it. And like once again, Gautam, thank you so much for doing this, and best of luck for like your future books to come.
Thank you so much. Thank you for having me.
Thank you so much, Gautam. That was such a wonderfully insightful conversation and also a lot of fun. hilarious at times, in fact. So many thanks to Gautam and Umang on behalf of our team and all our listeners for such a great time. This brings us to a close of the second episode of the MR show, and it's time for some Mithila plugins. If you enjoyed this episode, please sign up for our newsletters. You can also subscribe and support Mithila Review via Gumroad or Patreon. You're also welcome to join our Facebook community, Asian Science Fiction and Fantasy. You'll find the links in the chat box. Thank you for becoming a part of this conversation. We'll see you next time. Thank you, everyone.
Thank you, Ishita.